Welcome back, everybody. Today we are starting the learning unit, and specifically, we're going to be talking about classical conditioning, which is one of the most famous parts of psychology. So let's get on to it. Okay, so learning is defined as the process of acquiring through experience new and relatively enduring information or behaviors. So, two main types of learning we're going to focus on in this unit are associative learning and cognitive learning. If you remember behavioral or behaviorism perspective that we talked about, that's the one that's very much talking about like rewards and punishments and kind of that we can shape humans or animals into kind of doing whatever we want them to do, kind of like you're born a blank slate and everything is learned. Um, that's very much associative learning. So linking events together. So this consists of classical conditioning, which we're talking about today, and then operant conditioning, which is very much that rewards and punishments type one that we're going to talk about in the coming days. Cognitive learning is a little more higher level in thinking, hence the word cognitive being in there. So it's acquiring information by watching others, observing events, or through language. So there's three forms of learning that fall under this category we'll talk about later, which are observable learning, latent learning, and insight learning. Here's my little flow chart of all the types of learning, and I kind of place them on the continuum of nature to nurture. And if you remember, like I said, associative learning is very much tied in with the behavioral perspective, which we said is very much nurture because we talked about that quote, that idea that like John Watson said that like give him 100 healthy infants and he could shape them into being, if he's in a specified environment, shape them into being a beggar, a thief, a chef, a famous person, some successful business guru, millionaire, right? So he's very much under the camp of nurture, saying that, it's all about your environment and you can shape anyone to be anything that you want them to be. So associative learning is very much in accordance with nurture. And that's what we're going to be starting talking about in this unit first. So again, the repeat of behaviorism or behavioral perspective is the focus on observable behaviors and responses. So they don't care about what's going on in the mind. They don't care about biology. It's all about, shaping you through learning and rewards and punishments and things going on in your environment. So, specifically, we're starting today with a form of associative learning called classical conditioning. And just a reminder, associative learning is all about association. So, you are linking two things together, and that's how you're learning. It's very primitive, very basic, and that's why a lot of this is going to talk about animals and things because it's kind of your most basic form of learning. So, we're going to talk about Ivan Pavlov and classical conditioning. A lot of you might have heard of Pavlov's dogs before, and this is where this comes into play. So, Pavlov wasn't even a psychologist. He was actually a Russian scientist who was studying digestive process in dogs by looking at salivation. So, like their little, when they salivate and drool a little bit with food. But as he was going about this typical research, he also noticed something interesting coming about. He noticed that before the food arrived, the dogs would salivate. So the food wasn't even in front of them, but the dogs started salivating. And he realized that this was happening because as soon as the dogs heard the footsteps of the his assistant coming in, they knew the food was coming, so they started to salivate. So what the dogs had done is they engaged in this most primitive form of associative learning, which is classical conditioning, in which they associated, they learned, they linked together, right? Associative learning, they linked together the footsteps of the assistants with the food. They learned that, just hearing that little footsteps coming in meant that food was coming. And they signaled this by starting to salivate before they even got the food, just at the sound of the footsteps alone. This form of this happens with, I know my grandma talks about with her cat. He loved tuna, and the cat would just need to hear the crack of a tuna can, right? Didn't even have to smell it, and or even get the can opener out, and it would be running and ready to go get the food. So this is classical conditioning. So, like I said, it's the most primitive form of associative learning that states that through learning or some kind of training, typically, A previously neutral stimulus, which in this case was just the footsteps of his assistant, can be linked or associated with another stimulus and then gain a power to produce a certain response that it typically wouldn't produce. It's only doing that because it's associated with this other thing. Right? So they kind of, just like Pavlov's dogs, we learn to anticipate certain events because we're associating things together. You can watch this on your own time. This is the video of Pavlov's dogs. So we see here, this is classical conditioning going on. This is the formula for how this kind of associative property works. So I'm going to go through this more in depth, step by step, but this is kind of the overview of how this pairing and linking process works with classical conditioning. So we're going to talk about what all these terms mean of UCS, UCR, NS, all that jazz. So let's break it down. So first, we're going to be using the word stimulus and response. So a stimulus is any object or event or something that is going to cause or produce a response in an organism. So like a dog, an animal, a human. So stimulus is what is something in the environment causing you to produce a certain response. The response, right, is just the behavior that you're observing. So in the case of Pavlov's dogs, the naturally occurring thing is that the stimulus of food, right, naturally causes dogs to salivate. So food is the stimulus, the thing in the environment producing some kind of behavior. And then the response, so the behavior that's happening, is the dogs drooling and salivating. Other important term to know. So it's classical conditioning. What does conditioning mean? It's not conditioning your hair. So conditioning is just a fancy word for learning in this case, the process of learning or being taught something. So if something is labeled as conditioned in this case, so conditioned response we're going to hear, that just means something was learned. So it's a response or something you're doing that was taught that you learned. If something's unconditioned, then it means it's just a naturally occurring response, like a reflex. So something like the stimulus of a steak or food producing the response of a dog drooling, that's an unconditioned response because you're not taught that, right? It's just naturally food makes you drool. That's just instinctive, right? Just a reflex. The case of the footsteps causing you to drool, that is a conditioned response because it was taught. They learned it. They began to do this associative learning, putting it together. So now let's get into what all these kind of little terms mean of UCS, UCR, and all that jazz. So we're going to break down step by step how classical conditioning works, this form of learning. So how classical conditioning first starts is that you always have an unconditioned stimulus and an unconditioned response. Meaning when we said it's unconditioned, that learning has not yet occurred. This is just a naturally occurring reflexive response or relationship. So unconditioned stimulus, the object that's producing a response, in this case is food, right? Food naturally causes the unconditioned response of drooling or salivation. Right? Naturally occurring response, it's just reflective. You didn't learn this, it's just how it is naturally. So unconditioned stimulus, unconditioned response, the unlearned naturally occurring thing. Now, here's where classical conditioning really begins. You're going to add in a neutral stimulus. So something that originally did not elicit a response like this drooling one. Right? So something totally neutral that like on its own doesn't make you feel some type of way or, cause you to elicit a response. So in this case, the neutral stimulus of Pavlov is the footsteps or the bell. So in the original like observational thing that Pavlov did, he noticed that the footsteps caused the dogs to salivate. In the fancy experiment he did it to the tone of a bell. So every time he brought out the food, he would ring a bell to the point where then the dogs just started drooling at the sound of the bell alone without even the presentation of food. So like either of these would work. right? So in the case of the basic one that I brought up, right, footsteps alone don't do anything. They're just neutral, right? A bell alone doesn't do anything, it's neutral. But because it was paired and associated with that food several times, this unconditioned stimulus, now it's going to become not so neutral anymore. So, third step is introducing this neutral stimulus to the situation, which on its own doesn't cause a certain reaction. But eventually, we're going to see it will start causing that reaction because of this pairing. So, most important step in classical conditioning and how to get this to work is you are going to pair the neutral stimulus with the presentation of the unconditioned stimulus multiple times, so you learn to predict and associate these two things as like occurring together. So because the unconditioned stimulus causes the unconditioned response, you pairing the neutral stimulus and presenting it at the same time as the unconditioned stimulus leads you to associate those two things together, so much to the point that once you take away the unconditioned stimulus and just present the neutral stimulus alone, of the bell or footsteps, whatever it be, it's actually going to cause salvation even if you don't have the unconditioned stimulus of meat involved. So you're going to pair these together a bunch of times. So present bell or footsteps with the meat a bunch of different times, and that's going to, create that pairing, that association. So now here's our final steps. So learning has occurred. So we're seeing here, we're talking about conditioned stimulus and conditioned response. So these are the learned relationships or learned associations. So a conditioned stimulus is a stimulus that eventually produces a learned response by being paired with the unconditioned stimulus multiple times. So what the conditioned stimulus is actually what your neutral stimulus was. So in this case, the conditioned stimulus becomes the bell or the footsteps. It was the neutral, right? A lot before, the bell or the footsteps was just neutral. But now you've paired it so much that it has become a learned thing that the bell or the footsteps alone, without even the steak or food, is going to cause the conditioned reaction of drooling or salvation. So, right, here we go. So conditioned stimulus it's always going to be the neutral stimulus. So your neutral stimulus always becomes the conditioned stimulus. And then the conditioned response is basically 9 times out of 10 going to be what your unconditioned response is. If it isn't exactly what the unconditioned response is, it might be the same but just weaker. So if the unconditioned response is like throwing up, maybe your conditioned response is like feeling nauseous or something. So it's always going to be in the same ballpark, and really typically going to be like the same thing. So again, conditioned stimulus is just what your neutral stimulus was after it's been paired together a bunch, to the point where the neutral stimulus alone causes the response. Conditioned response is always going to be basically the same thing as the unconditioned response. So right, here we go. Unconditioned stimulus of steak or food causes unconditioned response of drooling. The bell or the footsteps was the neutral stimulus, but because you paired it all together so much, now the bell or footsteps alone has become the conditioned stimulus that alone produces a conditioned response of drooling. Learning has occurred, right? You've learned to associate these things together. That's why this alone causes that. Conditioned response, learning. So let's put it all together in our magic formula, or magic formulae, as SpongeBob would say. Okay, so unconditioned stimulus, unconditioned response, right? We've got food naturally causes drooling. Now, the conditioning is like the process, right here we see conditioning is the process of the pairing, right? It's the active process of learning. So during conditioning, this is also called acquisition, is the other word for learning in this case. So this is the process of pairing it all together. So you're pairing the bell or pairing the footsteps with the food, right? Pairing it all together multiple times, and that's causing the unconditioned response of salvation or drooling. So this is the learning process. So you've done this enough that now your neutral stimulus moves down here to a conditioned stimulus. So it becomes a conditioned stimulus at the point where the presentation of the bell or presentation of the footsteps, whatever the neutral stimulus is, presentation of that alone without the unconditioned stimulus is going to produce what that response is. And now that becomes the conditioned response. Okay. So that's mainly what I got for you. So using this, being really comfortable and kind of memorizing this formula of how classical conditioning works is really, really helpful. So I'm going to have us be plugging things in and practice problems into this formula a bunch of times. But get yourself comfortable with what these terms mean and the order of events and being able to read sample problems and identify what the unconditioned stimulus, unconditioned response, and all that stuff is. So there you go. That is classical conditioning.